Morning light slanted through the clerestory windows of St. Olave's Cathedral, spilling in long, respectable beams upon the worn stones and the modest bustle of the Thursday Ladies' Historical Society. Their once-monthly tour of significant local buildings had over time narrowed itself exclusively to the cathedral, largely because the vicar provided reliable heating and, on generous days, ecclesiastical biscuits of a quality surpassing those available in the town hall. At 10:30, Mrs. Ivy Malkin, chairwoman, by her own momentum rather than any election, shepherded her flock toward the north transept. They murmured appreciatively at carvings they'd seen many times before, rehearsing their admiration with the precision of a well-trained choir. "Note the choir stalls," she intoned, gesturing with a hand possessed of sufficient authority to have directed ships into harbour. 17th century. The finer details are simply exquisite. The ladies leaned in. Mrs. Malkin prepared for her usual commentary on craftsmanship and the regrettable tendency of modern joinery to rely more on glue than skill, but she halted mid-lecture as a thin rectangle of white caught her eye. It protruded a fraction from the carved gap between two panels of dark oak. At first, she assumed it must be a stray leaflet from a long-forgotten cathedral fete, but its placement, neat, intentional, suggested otherwise. "Ahem," she said, in the tone of one discovering an uninvited guest at a garden party. "What have we here?" Mrs. Malkin reached for it. The others gathered round as she eased out a folded sheet, crisp despite its dusty niche. The paper was oddly clean, unnaturally so for anything left among centuries-old woodwork. She opened it. The text was printed, no, typed, machine-typed, not in the elegant clatter of an old Underwood, but in a sterile, uniform typeface that looked like it belonged on a computer. More disquieting still was the date at the top, August 1994. One of the ladies gasped, another muttered something about ghosts with office equipment. Mrs. Malkin read the first lines aloud. "To the one who finds this, you will think the letter misplaced, perhaps even absurd. But it is meant for someone in your present day. I am writing because danger will come not from crime, but from omission." She stopped. Several faces turned toward her, half expecting her to translate these ominous statements into something comfortably bland. For once, Mrs. Malkin could not oblige. A flurry of uncertain questions rose. Is it a joke? Who put it there? Why would someone write to the future? Should we fetch someone? It was the last suggestion that found approval, and moments later a helpful verger was dispatched to summon the police, or, as the verger put it, Mr. Purbright, if he's not busy with anything more serious, though I can't imagine what would be. Inspector Walter Purbright was not a man accustomed to receiving urgent calls from cathedrals, drunks, bicycles chained to the mayoral statue, dogs with opinions about postmen. These were more common disturbances in Flaxford. A mysterious letter lodged in antique furniture was unusual enough to earn his presence. He arrived at St. Olave's with the calm gait of a man who disliked being rushed on principle. Dust danced in the sunlight as he stepped inside. The verger led him with evident relief toward the assembled ladies. "Inspector," Mrs. Malkin declared, "I do hope you're prepared for something exceedingly peculiar." Purbright offered her a polite smile. "I shall do my best, Mrs. Malkin. Peculiarity is a relative concept in Flaxford." The letter was handed to him. He unfolded it with the same care one gives to a newborn or an unfamiliar recipe. His eyes scanned the lines, pausing occasionally without comment. The text, though short, carried a tone of urgency and caution, yet lacked specific details, as if the writer feared being too clear. It referred to a matter that will one day be uncovered, and warned that Someone in authority may attempt to hide what should not be hidden. Purbright reread the date. 1994, not ancient nor new, just suspiciously misfiled. "Has anyone handled this besides yourselves?" he asked. "Only me," said Mrs. Malkin, in a tone suggesting she alone was qualified to handle mysterious documents of temporal ambiguity. "And it was tucked right between the stall panels?" "Yes." She pointed with precision. "Quite intentionally placed. One does not simply lose a typed communiqué in a choir stall." Purbright nodded, crouched, and examined the narrow crevice. The dust was disturbed only in a faint, recent streak, as though the paper had been inserted within the last few days rather than decades ago. He tucked this observation away, not secretively, simply quietly, which in his case amounted to much the same. Canon Hawtrey, the cathedral archivist, arrived in a mild state of agitation, which was his usual state, with only slight seasonal variation. "I must assure you," he said flutteringly, "that no letter of this, nature is part of our official holdings. Nothing from the 1990s is kept here. We barely keep anything past the Victorian era, unless it's been illuminated or bequeathed by someone insistent." "Someone could have placed it here recently," Purbright offered. The canon shuddered as though accused of misplacing the 10 Commandments. "I should hope not. We do not simply let people wander about sticking papers into consecrated woodwork." Mrs. Malkin made a discreet noise that suggested an opinion on the cathedral's recent choir festival organization. Purbright remained neutral. "Canon Hawtrey, who has regular access to this area?" "Well, it's the vergers, of course, myself, the choir, the volunteer historians. Occasionally tourists who ignore the velvet rope. Oh, and Mr. Venn. He's a local author with a rather loose interpretation of restricted area. But he only comes for inspiration." Purbright tucked the name away. People who wandered for inspiration often stumbled across trouble. He folded the letter neatly and slipped it into an evidence envelope. "I'll take this with me. For now, I should like to speak with the person who first noticed it." Mrs. Malkin straightened proudly. "That would be me." "I suspected as much." A faint ripple of satisfaction passed through her entourage. Purbright asked several questions, each polite, each gentle, each gathering shape in his mind. When he finished, he took one last look at the choir stall. The dust was disturbed in a pattern that didn't quite match the age of the letter. Something else caught his eye, a small triangle of glossy colour peeking from another hymnal on the nearby stall. He did not retrieve it. Not yet. The ladies watched him expectantly. "Well?" Mrs. Malkin demanded. "Do you think it's important?" Purbright offered the mildest shrug. "Everything is important to someone, Mrs. Malkin. The question is to whom and why." As he walked out of the cathedral, a breeze through the nave stirred the letter's absence, as though the choir stall itself exhaled after holding its secret for far too long. The news of the letter travelled from the cathedral to the cloister tea-room with the brisk efficiency of a well-trained homing pigeon, though considerably less accuracy. By noon, the original discovery, a single sheet of typed text, tucked discreetly behind a choir stall, had grown, in popular retelling, into a cryptic scroll discovered stuffed into the mouth of a carved cherub, possibly glowing, and certainly forewarning catastrophe. The ladies who had witnessed the actual event attempted, with mixed success, to retain proprietary control over the story. But gossip in Flaxford was like incense. Once released, it drifted everywhere, clinging to the least deserving surfaces. Mrs. Felicity Groves was first to reinterpret the morning's events for a broader audience, A part-time volunteer archivist and full-time dispenser of unsolicited historical trivia, she presided over her teacup with the air of someone conducting a séance. "It was unmistakably a warning," she said, in a voice quiet enough to force everyone to lean closer. "A message intended for the future. These things do happen, you know. There was that business with the sealed prophecy at Ely in the 70s. "What prophecy was that?" asked a woman who had never visited Ely but felt suddenly that she should have. "Oh, sealed in a wall cavity. Predicted a scandal involving the bishop's nephew, and a sheepdog trial caused no end of embarrassment." Mrs. Groves sipped delicately. "It nearly ruined the summer fete raffle." Across the tea room, two Cathedral vergers on their lunch break muttered less creative theories. One suggested the letter had been placed by a tourist with odd humour. The other proposed a disgruntled chorister citing the universal principle that any building housing more than 15 children was destined for mischief. Canon Hawtrey himself arrived shortly afterward, flustered and pink about the ears. He ordered a scone with the distracted severity of someone who felt he deserved it. The moment he sat down, a pair of regulars swooped in. "Canon, they're saying it's a government thing, something secret." "Is it?" asked a man whose only previous interaction with government secrecy involved incorrectly filling out a tax form. "A government thing?" Hawtrey blinked rapidly. "It is nothing of the sort. Absolutely nothing. Pure nonsense." This, of course, was taken as confirmation by everyone present. His denial had been too quick, too emphatic, and delivered with the air of someone defending innocence before anyone asked. Meanwhile, Inspector Purbright walked past the tea-room window, hands in pockets, heading toward the police station. His presence alone provoked immediate speculation. "There, you see," whispered Mrs. Groves triumphantly. "He's on the trail already." "Do you suppose the letter was threatening someone?" asked another lady. Mrs. Groves permitted herself a measured nod. "It would not surprise me. There are papers in that cathedral that haven't seen daylight in decades. Some people might have good reason to keep them buried." "Who?" "Well," she said, lowering her voice even further, "I don't like to speak ill of anyone, but the late Dean's accounts were never what one might call transparent. And then there's the matter of the repair funds for the west window." She paused, ensuring she had attracted the appropriate number of listeners. "Some discrepancies have been whispered about." Canon Hawtrey, overhearing this last remark, turned a shade warmer. "The funds were allocated correctly," he declared from across the room, scone halfway to his mouth. "There were simply adjustments entirely justified by structural concerns." "Structural concerns?" Mrs. Groves raised a knowing eyebrow. "Yes," Hawtrey insisted, his voice cracking slightly. "Very concerning structures." A polite silence settled, the kind that indicated everyone had drawn their own conclusions and none favoured the canon. At another table, Rollo Venn, local novelist, amateur hoaxer, and wearer of scarves regardless of weather, leaned back with theatrical interest. "A mysterious message to the future," he murmured to the young waitress, who regretted asking if he wanted milk. "It's practically an invitation for interpretation." She nodded vaguely, having learned that engaging Venn inevitably led to being recast as a muse in a semi-autobiographical thriller. "What sort of interpretation?" she asked, more out of self-defense than curiosity. "Oh, any number, a temporal anomaly, a secret confession, a clue left by someone constrained by circumstance." He fluttered his fingers. "Or perhaps it was left by someone who foresaw danger but could not risk disclosure in their own era." "Seems a long way to go to cause trouble," she remarked. "That," Venn said solemnly, "is the very definition of history." By mid-afternoon, the entire tea room, indeed the entire cloister walk, was humming. A group of council clerks passing by were overheard discussing whether the letter pertained to zoning irregularities. A retired schoolteacher was certain it was a coded message referencing a lost manuscript. A pair of tourists believed it to be part of a ghost tour they had not paid for, but were keen to join. Through all this embroidery, one consistent thread persisted. Inspector Purbright had taken the letter, and now, having taken it, he was certainly thinking about it. The town found this idea both comforting and faintly thrilling. Purbright thinking was, in rare instances, followed by something more serious than parking infractions. Canon Hawtrey attempted to calm the crowd by asserting the letter was a mere curiosity of no importance, but this claim suffered from a fatal miscalculation. He said it loudly. A statement delivered loudly in Flaxford was invariably heard as a denial issued under duress. Mrs. Groves, observing his discomfort, concluded matters with a sage-sounding summary. "You will find," she said, stirring her tea, "that letters appearing in old places rarely tell the whole truth, but they almost always hide something." No one knew precisely what the letter hid, but this did nothing to hinder speculation. In fact, it improved it. And somewhere in the noise of rumour and conjecture, a small truth clung quietly to the edges, that the letter, though dated 30 years past, had been placed behind the choir stall not long ago at all. That part no one had yet guessed, but Inspector Purbright, walking back toward the station, had already begun to suspect it. Inspector Purbright's return to the station was brief. He deposited the letter carefully in a drawer, not officially evidence yet, not officially anything at all, and after a moment's consideration, walked back toward the cathedral. It was not impatience that drew him there, but a sense that the longer one allowed Flaxford gossip to settle, the harder it became to extract the truth from beneath it. Canon Hawtrey greeted him near the cloister entrance with an eagerness that suggested he had been rehearsing an apology. "Inspector, I must say again what a perfectly unnecessary fuss this is. One stray piece of paper and half the town believes the cathedral is housing conspiracies." Purbright smiled mildly. "The town requires little encouragement for that sort of belief." "Yes, well, I should prefer they redirect their enthusiasm toward choir attendance." Hawtrey cleared his throat. "You wish to speak with me?" In due course," Purbright replied. "But first I should like to see where your records are kept. I'm interested in the procedures. Who has access, who does not." The archivist's expression flickered, not quite alarm, but something adjacent to it, like a man startled by the sudden rearrangement of his own furniture. "Our archives," he said, "are perfectly well organized. Controlled access, signed logbook, humidity regulation, quite modern, well, reasonably modern." "May I see them?" Hawtrey swallowed, nodded, and led the way. The cathedral archive lived in a modest stone annex, neither grand nor neglected. Inside it smelled of paper, polish, and a faint whiff of anxiety. Rows of cabinets stood with the strictness of soldiers. Hawtrey moved between them with the reverent caution of someone handling relics, even when touching nothing at all. "Here," he said, gesturing toward a desk covered in carefully stacked folders. "These are volunteer review materials, nothing to do with the letter, of course, entirely unrelated." "I see," Purbright said gently. He took a slow turn about the room, observing without touching. The space was tidy enough, though not as immaculate as the canon seemed to believe. A few drawers were slightly ajar. A small pile of recently consulted documents lay next to the logbook. It did not escape Purbright's notice that the logbook's pages were crisp with disuse. If visitors had been signing regularly, they did so invisibly. "Your volunteers," Purbright said after a moment. "Who works here most often?" Several capable ladies, Hawtrey replied quickly. Mrs. Malkin, occasionally. Mrs. Groves, quite frequently. Others help when needed. Mrs. Groves, Purbright repeated, as though testing the fit of the name in the air. She mentioned to someone today that there once was some dispute involving sealed documents. Hawtrey's colour rose with disconcerting speed. Ah, yes, entirely trivial. She misunderstood the matter, a misfiled set of accounts from the 1950s. I corrected it myself. Misfiled where? Nowhere significant, Hawtrey said far too quickly, and certainly not connected to this modern contrivance. Purbright allowed the silence to widen, giving the canon room either to elaborate or retreat. Hawtrey chose a combination of both. It is my firm belief, he said, smoothing non-existent creases in his cassock, that someone planted that letter purely to provoke excitement. A prank. Probably Mr. Venn. You know how he is with his... He waved a hand, failing to find a polite synonym for attention-seeking. When did Mr. Venn last access the archives? Oh, practically never. He claims to conduct research, but his interests are more dramatic than scholarly. Purbright moved toward the table where volunteer materials were kept. A single folder lay slightly out of alignment, as if someone had closed it in haste. He opened it. Inside were cataloguing sheets, mostly mundane, except for one page on which someone had written a note in hurried pencil. Check restricted box, west window accounts. Missing invoice? Restricted box? Purbright asked quietly. Merely a designation for materials requiring careful handling, Hawtrey stammered. Some records are fragile. That box contains financial documents, nothing else. Does it live here? The canon hesitated. No, it is kept in the vestry safe. We don't bring it out unless necessary. Has it been brought out recently? Certainly not, Hawtrey replied. Too fast again. Purbright replaced the sheet. May I speak to your volunteers? Mrs. Groves, perhaps? Of course. She should be in shortly. She never misses an opportunity to be involved. As if summoned by reputation alone, Mrs. Felicity Groves appeared moments later, carrying a tote bag printed with Tudor roses and an expression suggesting she had been expecting a summons. Inspector, you want me? She said, as though he had issued a royal proclamation. Only a brief word, Purbright replied. Hawtrey watched from the background, hands clasped, eyes twitching. Purbright motioned Mrs. Groves aside. You said earlier there was once a dispute over sealed documents. What sort of dispute? Oh, nothing dramatic, she said, sounding delighted by the drama of it. A set of accounts from the late 20th century that had been boxed, sealed and, some thought, forgotten. The previous dean had a habit of sealing things, obsessive man, possibly nervous. The box was eventually reopened under, supervised conditions. Supervised by whom? Canon Hawtrey, of course. And was anything amiss? A few inconsistencies, Mrs. Groves murmured. Tiny ones, hardly criminal. But one does wonder why someone was so keen to hide them. She cast a glance toward Hawtrey, who pretended interest in a filing cabinet he had inspected twice already. Purbright folded his hands. Do you think this letter could relate to those documents? Oh, Inspector, she said with a smile too knowing for comfort. In old buildings, everything relates to everything eventually. Purbright did not answer. He simply thanked her, left the archive, and stepped into the cool air of the cloister. The cathedral bell tolled the half-hour. Footsteps echoed faintly in the nave. Somewhere behind him, Hawtrey muttered to himself, trying to reconstruct an explanation he might never be asked to give. And as Purbright walked away, he realized that the letter's warning about omission did not sound quite so abstract anymore. Someone, it seemed, had been omitting quite deliberately. Inspector Purbright had not yet returned to the station when the first attempt to tidy the entire affair into a neat conclusion reached him. It came in the form of Councillor Roper, who intercepted him just outside the cathedral precinct, with the breathless urgency of a man whose theories always outpaced his evidence. "Inspector, just the person I hoped to catch," Roper announced, tugging his blazer into a shape it had never naturally possessed. "I believe I can save you a considerable amount of trouble regarding that letter." Purbright regarded him with the patient politeness he reserved for those who mistook enthusiasm for assistance. "How very considerate of you, Councillor." Roper lowered his voice with conspiratorial relish. "You needn't look any further than Rollo Venn. The fellow practically advertises mischief, always poking about, scribbling in corners, claiming he's researching something. You know the type." "A writer?" Purbright suggested. Roper sniffed. "A dramatist, Inspector. And dramatists are always up to something." He tapped the side of his nose. "You mark my words. He planted that letter just to stir excitement for his next book. These people thrive on chaos." Purbright made no comment, which Roper incorrectly interpreted as approval. "I shall take that silence as agreement," he declared. "In fact, if you require a formal statement, I am perfectly prepared to supply one. You'll want to strike while the trail is hot, unleash the full weight of the law, show him we're not a town to be trifled with." "Flaxford," Purbright said gently, "is rarely trifled with intentionally." But Roper had already taken his own certainty as permission to hurry off toward the council building, muttering about cultural vandalism. Purbright allowed himself a small exhale and continued down the close, where he soon spotted Rollo Venn himself perched on a low stone wall, legs crossed, notebook resting theatrically upon one knee. A silk scarf fluttered around his neck with a purpose unrelated to warmth. "Inspector," Venn called out before Purbright had spoken a word. "I assume you are here to interrogate me?" "That had not been my immediate intention," Purbright replied mildly. Venn closed his notebook with a flourish. "Pity. I'd prepared a very compelling alibi." "I'm sure you did," Purbright said, "but since you've brought it up, I might as well ask." Venn leaned forward eagerly. "Ah, very well. At the precise time the letter must have been planted, I was engaged in a séance." Purbright blinked once. "A séance?" "With Mrs. Pembury and 2 members of the Poetry Club, attempting to contact Edgar Allan Poe. It was largely unsuccessful, though one of the table legs did wobble." "And they would confirm this?" "Oh, certainly. They have an exaggerated respect for paranormal etiquette. I assure you, Inspector, if I had tampered with choir stalls, they would have had words." Purbright studied him for a moment. The man was elaborate in speech, theatrical in gesture, and completely transparent in intention. It was difficult to imagine him committing any secretive act without announcing it in advance, possibly with flyers. "What do you make of the letter?" Purbright asked. Venn brightened even more. "Intriguing, mysterious, badly written, if I may say so, not nearly enough atmosphere. Whoever composed it lacked narrative flair." "Do you recognize the style?" "Not at all. If anything, it reads like someone trying very hard not to be noticed." Purbright nodded slightly. "Thank you." Venn straightened with disappointment. "Is that all? No threat to my civil liberties? No accusations?" "Not today," Purbright said, and resumed walking. Venn called after him. "Do let me know if it turns into a murder. My publisher loves those." The suggestion hung absurdly in the air, but Purbright did not dignify it with a response. He reached the high street as the afternoon settled into its usual rhythm. Shops opened their doors to catch the last of the foot traffic. A bus coughed apologetically at the stop. The cathedral tower loomed above the rooftops, a sentinel observing the small dramas below. Burton, one of Purbright's constables, emerged from the bakery carrying 2 paper bags and an expression of guilty pleasure. "Inspector, Councillor Roper sent word me. He says he's solved the case already." "So I gathered," Purbright murmured. "He says it's definitely Mr. Venn. Says the man's a menace." "Roper believes anyone who owns a typewriter to be a menace." Burton grinned. "Well, sir, Mr. Venn does seem odd enough." "Oddness," Purbright replied, "is not an offence. Besides, those who are most eager to clear mysteries rarely understand them." Burton nodded, though without much conviction, and held out one of the paper bags. "Bun?" Purbright thanked him and accepted. They walked together a short distance before the inspector paused outside the cathedral gate once more. Something tugged at his mind. The hurried pencil note about the restricted box, Hawtrey's defensive manner, the dust disturbed in the choir stall. None of it pointed cleanly to any one person, but all of it pointed away from Venn. Too easy, too enthusiastically embraced by half the town. "Sir," Burton said quietly, "do you really think the letter means anything?" Purbright took a small bite of the bun, considering. "Meaning is a flexible commodity, Burton. Some people generate it where there is none. Others conceal it where there is plenty." "You think someone's hiding something?" Purbright glanced back toward the cathedral. "Someone usually is." The evening bells began to ring, echoing through the streets with a softness that belied the unease settling over the old stone building. Purbright watched the tower for a moment longer, then turned away, his thoughts arranging themselves with a slow, deliberate precision that made him such an inconvenient detective for those who preferred mysteries to remain unsolved. The town might have its convenient suspect in Mr. Venn, but convenience, in Purbright's experience, rarely told the truth. Inspector Purbright returned to the cathedral the following morning, with the quiet certainty that mysteries, like mice, tended to reveal themselves only when one moved slowly enough not to startle them. The nave was almost empty at that hour, save for a cleaner pushing a wheeled mop bucket in slow, contemplative circles. A faint echo rose with each step, as though the building itself remembered yesterday's gossip and found it tiresome. Purbright made his way to the choir stalls where the discovery had begun. The morning light caught the dark wood unevenly, highlighting the intricate carving on one panel while leaving another in shadow. He crouched, not to re-examine the crevice where the letter had been found, but to glance again at the hymnal on the adjacent stall, the one showing a small sliver of glossy colour. Yesterday, he had deliberately left it undisturbed. Today, he slid it gently free. Inside the binding, between 2 yellowed pages of hymns seldom sung, was a torn scrap of modern magazine paper. A corner of a printed advertisement, bright colours, blocky lettering, and a sliver of text. "The future begins with us." Beneath it was the faint part of a logo, a stylized metallic swirl, typical of late-century technology branding. Purbright did not touch the scrap directly. He used a handkerchief to lift the corner. The paper was unmistakably from the 1990s or later, glossy and unweathered. He replaced it precisely as he had found it, then straightened slowly. A modern magazine fragment in a centuries-old hymnal was not evidence in itself, but its presence was suggestive. Someone had rummaged here recently enough to leave a trace. And not someone casually flipping pages. The scrap had been wedged at an angle that implied deliberate insertion or frantic closing. He heard soft steps behind him. Mrs. Malkin emerged, guardian-like, from the shadowed arch near the choir loft. She carried a notebook and wore an expression that hovered between pride and indignation. "Inspector," she said, "back again?" "Still only looking," Purbright replied. "We must all do our part," she declared. "I have been taking notes, observations. One never knows when something one notices will be important." "Indeed," he said politely. She glanced at the hymnal he had just been examining. Ah, I see you've discovered that dreadful scrap. I told Canon Hawtrey last week that the choir boys were leaving bits of their nonsense everywhere. Stickers, sweet wrappers, electronic game papers. It may not be them, Purbright said mildly. Mrs. Malkin seemed delighted by this possibility. Someone else, then? Someone sneaking? Her voice carried the hopeful air of one longing for scandal that could be recounted at length over tea. I wouldn't wish to speculate yet, Purbright said. She leaned closer. Inspector, I must tell you, purely for your records, of course, that Mrs. Groves seemed terribly excited yesterday, too excited, almost as though she knew something before it happened. Purbright recalled Mrs. Groves's animated recounting at the tea room. Did she say anything to you directly? Oh, she always says things directly, Mrs. Malkin replied, but never the things you want to hear. Still, she was quite keen to impress upon me that certain cathedral matters had been handled improperly in the past. That subject does appear to interest more than one person, Purbright said. Mrs. Malkin nodded vigorously. Well, if you ask me, this letter, this whole business, is tied up with some old irregularities no one wishes to discuss. Mark my words. She wandered off after delivering this prophecy, leaving Purbright alone once more. He moved further down the row of choir stalls, examining the pattern of dust on each surface. Most were evenly coated, the quiet work of time and neglect. But two of the stall, as including the one from which the letter had been retrieved, showed distinct disruptions, faint but undeniable. Someone had leaned here recently, or steadied themselves, or reached for something small. Purbright straightened in time to see Canon Hawtrey approaching from the far end of the nave, his walk brisk as though determined not to appear nervous. "Inspector," Hawtrey said, "I didn't expect you quite so early." "Cathedrals are most honest in the morning," Purbright replied. "One sees the small things more clearly." Hawtrey's smile faltered. "Yes, well, I hope you're not finding too many small things." "Hard to say, though I did notice an unusual fragment inside one of the hymnals." Hawtrey blinked rapidly. Hymnals contain many fragments, loose pages, bookmarks, notes left by previous generations of worshippers. "This one appeared rather recent?" "Recent?" Hawtrey repeated. His voice attempted calm, but stumbled over an edge of apprehension. "Ah, yes, well, we do occasionally host youth groups. They leave all sorts of modern clutter." Purbright studied the canon gently, without pressure. "When were the youth groups last here?" "Last month," Hawtrey said quickly. "Perhaps early last month, but I assure you they were closely supervised." "Of course." Purbright let the matter drift. "Canon, I should like to see the vestry safe." Hawtrey's fingers tightened around the folder he carried. "The safe? But the documents inside are of negligible relevance. I cannot see how—" "Even negligible relevance is still relevance," Purbright said in the same easy tone. With visible resignation, Hawtrey nodded and escorted him to the vestry. The safe was small, brass-handled, and older than Hawtrey liked to admit. He opened it reluctantly. Inside were several boxes neatly labelled. One in particular bore the words "West Window Accounts, 1989-1997, restricted." "That's the one Mrs. Groves mentioned," Purbright said casually. "Indeed, though I caution you, Inspector, the irregularities she refers to were largely imaginary." Purbright did not open the box. He merely noted the thin layer of dust atop it, thinner than on the adjacent ones. Someone had handled it recently. The faintest trace of a fingertip smudge lingered along the edge. "Thank you," Purbright said simply. Hawtrey closed the safe quickly, perhaps too quickly. Purbright stepped back into the cool stone corridor and paused, reflecting. A letter warning about a mission. A magazine scrap placed carelessly or urgently. A restricted box moved just enough to disturb the dust. None of these items formed a clear picture, yet each belonged to the same puzzle. The mystery, he felt, was not about what had been written in 1994, but what someone did not wish discovered in the present. And for that reason, the glossy scrap in the hymnal, so irrelevant on the surface, lingered in his thoughts long after he left the cathedral. Inspector Purbright spent the early afternoon reviewing his notes, though reviewing in his case consisted mostly of quiet thought and slow walks that took him nowhere in particular until they revealed something useful. The cathedral precincts, with their mixture of age and habit, served as an ideal landscape for such contemplation. He had no specific direction in mind when he stepped along the gravel path, yet he found himself approaching the modest row of cottages occupied by long-serving cathedral staff. The first door belonged to Mr. Edwin Tressel, an organ technician whose reputation for precision rivaled his talent for dissatisfaction. Tressel opened the door with an expression that implied interruption was his permanent condition. "Inspector," he said flatly, "if this is about the rumour going around, I assure you I do not deal in anonymous letters, or any letters. I prefer people speak plainly." "A preference not universally shared," Purbright replied. "Might I trouble you for a moment of your time?" Tressel stepped aside stiffly. His cottage was neat to the point of severity. Manuals, tuning forks, and half-dismantled organ pipes were arranged like museum exhibits. A kettle hissed on the hob with reluctant obedience. "You work in the cathedral frequently," Purbright began, "close to the choir stalls." "Daily," Tressel said. "Some of those pipes are older than the stones. They squeal like infants unless you coax them properly." "Did you notice anything out of place recently?" Tressel's brow furrowed. "Out of place? In that building? Inspector, everything is always out of place. Choir boys move books. Vergers shift stands. Well-meaning parishioners straighten things that were straight already. But if you mean recently—" He paused, arms folded tightly. "I did notice someone near the restricted area, or rather, I noticed someone trying not to be noticed." Purbright waited. "Tall fellow?"
"Middle-aged, wore a coat too good for rummaging around old records. I saw him slip out a side door near the vestry last week. Thought little of it at the time." "Could you describe him?" Tressel squinted. "Hard to say. I believe he's a new addition to the Friends of St. Olave's Society. They come in droves, all convinced they're preserving something. I preserve things for a living, so I have little patience for amateurs." "Did you see him again?" "Not since, but he was carrying something under his coat. A folder, perhaps." Purbright inclined his head. "Thank you." Tressel, apparently satisfied at having provided useful information, returned his attention to the kettle and muttered something about the moral decline of cathedral volunteers. Purbright left the cottage and followed the lane toward a quieter corner of the precinct, where small gardens lay tucked between ancient walls. A retired codebreaker named Mr. Lionel Craik lived there, a man whose brain, according to town law, continued deciphering patterns even in his sleep. Purbright found him trimming a rose bush with the intensity usually reserved for bomb disposal. "Mr. Craik?" he greeted. The old man straightened, blinking as though dragged from a distant calculation. "Inspector." "Ah, I wondered when you might seek me out." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "You expected me?" Craik gestured vaguely toward the cathedral. "When something inexplicable occurs within a historical structure, the police inevitably consult someone who has spent a lifetime noticing inconsistencies. Not that I know anything yet, mind you, but I expect to." Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. Have you been inside the cathedral lately? Every Tuesday, Craig replied. I catalogue inscriptions for the volunteer group. Keeps the mind limber. Did you notice anyone behaving strangely? Craig considered this with exaggerated precision. Strange behavior is difficult to measure. Most people behave strangely when confronted with old stones, makes them feel their own mortality. But 3 days ago I did notice Mrs. Groves speaking rather intently with a visitor near the north transept. A visitor? Yes, nice smile, forgettable shoes, no badge or volunteer pass. She was showing him something in her tote bag. Looked like documents. Could you describe him? Craig shrugged. Middle height, civil service type possibly, the sort of man who apologizes even while bumping into you and then proceeds to walk away briskly. There was nothing overtly suspicious about him except the way he glanced over his shoulder when he left. People only do that when they fear being followed, or wish to appear as though they do. Interesting, Purbright murmured. Craig resumed trimming. If you find out anything of substance, do let me know. I enjoy a good puzzle. Purbright left him to his roses and continued toward the cloister garden, where he
noticed a familiar figure guiding a pair of tourists, Mrs. Adelaide Winkfield, cathedral guide and serial embellisher of recorded history. She greeted Purbright with theatrical joy. "Inspector, come to join the tour?" "I fear my schedule doesn't permit it," Purbright said gently. "Oh, nonsense. One must always make time for edification." She turned to her tourists. "This is Inspector Purbright, who once solved a case involving a stolen baptismal font." "I believe," Purbright corrected softly, "it was merely misplaced behind a curtain." "Yes, but stolen adds gravitas." When the tourists drifted toward a display board, Mrs. Winkfield leaned closer. "I imagine you're investigating the letter. Everyone is talking about it. Quite the stir." "So I've gathered. Have you any thoughts?" "Only that secrets have a peculiar way of surfacing in religious buildings. Emotional resonance, you see. Old grievances become restless, and I've always said some of our volunteers know more than they admit." "Which volunteers?" She pursed her lips. "Mrs. Groves, to begin with. She thrives on secrets. And then there's Mr. Rixby, the former assistant treasurer. Retired, allegedly. Yet he's been visiting more often lately. From what I hear, certain financial matters from years ago still trouble him." Purbright nodded slowly. "You've noticed him inside the cathedral?" "Twice this week. Lurking about the vestry, though lurking might be uncharitable. Standing with intent, perhaps." Purbright thanked her, though she hardly needed encouragement to continue speaking. She lowered her voice to a whisper, fat with importance. "And, Inspector, someone has been borrowing the spare keys. I saw the ring hanging differently yesterday. Someone took one and put it back crooked." "You're certain?" "As certain as I am that the bishop's coat of arms is painted the wrong shade of blue." Purbright left her mid-speech, as courteously as possible, and walked back into the shadowed nave. The air carried the faint smell of beeswax and incense, mingled with something else, the quiet pressure of too many stories intersecting, a nervous archivist, a too eager councilman, a novelist with an absurd alibi, a choir stall dusted in the wrong place, a magazine scrap from the wrong decade, and now a growing cast of individuals with reasons, mild or otherwise, to fear old documents surfacing. Purbright paused near the choir stalls again, letting the silence settle around him. It occurred to him that the letter's phrase about danger coming from omission might refer not to a crime committed, but to one nearly forgotten. Something that had slumbered in the cathedral's records until someone decided to protect it a little too forcefully. and somewhere among the volunteers, technicians, former treasurers, and perplexed guides, someone had begun to move pieces around in an effort to keep history from being read correctly. As Purbright stepped back into the daylight, he sensed the investigation widening, not like a net, but like a shadow, spreading quietly, patiently, waiting for the precise angle from which everything would suddenly make sense. The disturbance came at an inconvenient hour, as disturbances generally do, shortly after midnight, when the cathedral lay in its most solemn silence. A faint metallic clatter drifted through the colonnade and reached the half-dozing ears of Mr. Dallow, senior verger and light sleeper by vocation. At first he attributed it to wind, then to a dream, then, with rising dread, to human presence. By the time he had put on his coat and located his lantern, the sound had stopped. Yet something in the stillness felt newly unsettled, as though the building itself held its breath. He performed a cautious circuit, the nave, the south aisle, the choir stalls. Nothing seemed out of place. Only when he reached the vestry door did a faint smell of dislodged dust greet him. That dry, powdery scent of things moved when they ought not to be. The door was locked, but not quite flush with its frame. Someone had closed it in haste. Dallow relocked it firmly, muttered a prayer containing more irritation than piety, and made a note to inform the police. He did not, however, open the vestry. At his age, discretion outran curiosity. The next morning, a message reached Inspector Purbright before he had finished his tea. Within half an hour he was standing beside Dallow in the echoing cathedral, listening to the man's account delivered with the solemnity of a witness at a royal inquest. "It was no ordinary noise, Inspector," Dallow insisted. "Not rodents, not wind. Something metal shifted. I know the sound of our candlesticks and collection plates well enough." "And nothing was missing?" "Not that I could see, but you must understand, in a cathedral absence doesn't always make itself known at once." Purbright nodded, glancing toward the vestry. "And the door?" "Closed, but not properly. Whoever left was in a hurry." Purbright stepped forward and knelt to inspect the base of the door. There was a faint scuff on the stone threshold, fresh, sharp-edged. Someone had indeed moved quickly. Canon Hawtrey appeared moments later, summoned by the whisper of commotion. He looked more harassed than usual, and a small puff of white chalk clung to his sleeve, as though he had leaned against something in his haste. "Inspector, I've just heard. Dreadful business, but truly I'm certain nothing has been disturbed. I checked the vestry myself not an hour ago, all quite intact." "You checked it?" Purbright asked mildly. "Yes. Well, after Dallow told me of the incident, naturally." Hawtrey smoothed his sleeve, brushing away the chalk too late. "We maintain strict order, Inspector. Nothing inside has any value worth stealing. Old registers, minor accounts, the occasional."
"Vestment. And the restricted box?" Hawtrey hesitated. "You mean the West Window records?" "Yes, quite in place, precisely where they should be." Purbright said nothing. His silence, however, was not the kind people overlooked. It pressed gently, firmly, like a finger against a bruise. Hawtrey cleared his throat. Someone must have slipped in accidentally, a misguided enthusiast, or perhaps Mr. Venn again. Purbright inspected the vestry doorframe. "Has anyone else reported strange activity lately?" Dallow coughed meaningfully. "Mr. Rixby was here late yesterday afternoon, after Vespers. Said he'd come to count candle receipts, but he left in a hurry when I mentioned the missing key last week." Purbright turned. "Missing key?" Hawtrey blanched. "A misunderstanding? One of the spare keys was misplaced briefly. It was found again." "Where?" "On the ring," Hawtrey said too quickly. "Right where it belonged." Purbright refrained from asking how one misplaced an object only to find it exactly where it was supposed to be. Instead, he stepped inside the vestry as Hawtrey reluctantly unlocked it. The air inside was cool, still, and tinged with the faint sweetness of incense soaked into wood. Rows of vestments hung like quiet sentinels. A table bore 3 brass candlesticks recently polished, and on the far wall, the safe. Purbright approached it slowly. Hawtrey hovered behind him, breathing the way one does when attempting to control both fear and explanation. "When you checked earlier," Purbright said without turning, "did you open the safe?" "Only to assure myself the contents were undisturbed." "May I see them?" Hawtrey's hand trembled as he produced the key. The safe door swung open with its usual reluctant creak. Boxes sat neatly inside, their paper labels yellowed but legible. Purbright's gaze fell on the restricted box. It was aligned with the others, yet a faint trace of movement betrayed it, a thin crescent of cleaner stone beneath, just wide enough to show it had been shifted and replaced. He bent closer. The dust pattern was unmistakably fresh. Hawtrey swallowed audibly. "Inspector, I assure you—" I know," Purbright said gently. "You assure me frequently." He lifted the box only a fraction, enough to confirm that one corner bore a smudge, a thumbprint in a thin streak of transferred dust. The print was too smudged to be readable, but the gesture of someone hurriedly lifting, checking, and replacing was unmistakable. Hawtrey's composure thinned visibly.
"Perhaps someone brought it out yesterday. I may have forgotten. There is a great deal to manage." Purbright replaced the box exactly as it had been. "Who besides you has access to this safe?" "Only myself and Mr. Rixby when he was still treasurer, but he has no reason to come here any more." Hawtrey hesitated. "Not a legitimate reason, at least." Purbright thanked him and closed the safe gently. The gesture seemed to ease Hawtrey's panic slightly, though not enough to conceal it. Outside, the nave filled with soft footfall as parishioners drifted in for morning prayers. Sunlight crept across the stone floor like a slow, deliberate hand. Purbright took in the cathedral's quiet grandeur, its layered centuries of secrets. An anonymous letter planted where it would be found, a glossy scrap from a modern magazine, a volunteer seen whispering with an unknown visitor, a box of financial records disturbed in the night. And now someone entering this sacred space after dark, not to steal, but to check something, to confirm, to ensure the past stayed politely buried. Purbright exhaled lightly. The disturbance had not been a theft, it had been a reassurance. Someone was frightened, and frightened people made mistakes. Inspector Purbright returned to the station shortly after noon, carrying with him not evidence in the formal sense, but a growing tangle of impressions. In his experience, impressions were often more revealing than fingerprints. They came from the subtle rearrangement of a person's features when asked the right question, the dust displaced by a recently moved object, or the conspicuous neatness someone adopted when feeling judged. He sat at his desk, the letter from the choir stall resting beside him like an uninvited guest. The paper, still crisp from its unlikely hiding place, seemed to hum faintly with withheld explanation. He read it again, slowly, letting the peculiar tones seep into his thoughts. Danger will come not from crime, but from omission. He tapped the sheet lightly. A warning written not in panic, but careful, deliberate restraint. A letter addressed ambiguously, not to a name, but to the one who finds this. And oddly modern in its phrasing, as though someone had been at pains to sound neutral, almost mechanical. Purbright leaned back, considering that particular flavour of language, a lack of flourish, a measured, clipped cadence, not the style of someone hiding guilt, but of someone fearful of being misinterpreted or fearful of being traced. His mind drifted back through the week's encounters. Canon Hawtrey's defensive manner, Tressel's unvarnished resentment, Mrs. Groves's appetite for secrets, Rixby's recent return to the cathedral precincts, each orbiting around the question of records: who created them, who kept them, and who might hope they never saw sunlight again. He set the letter aside and reached for his notes, though notes were seldom the true vessel of his deduction. He preferred thought that meandered like water around stones, finding its own course until the pattern emerged. The glossy magazine scrap in the hymnal resurfaced in his mind. A modern intrusion within an ancient volume? Not left by accident, he felt certain. Whoever placed it did so while handling the hymnal, possibly while placing the letter or while searching for something else entirely. But why distract themselves with a hymnal when the vestry safe held far more consequential material? Unless the scrap had belonged to the intruder. A fragment torn loose as they closed the hymnal hurriedly. Many clues were created not by intent, but clumsiness. He imagined the midnight visitor fumbling with a hymnal while hurrying from the choir stalls to the vestry. A person accustomed to the cathedral's layout, but flustered. Perhaps someone surprised by a noise, the approaching footfall of Mr. Dallow, someone who believed no one would look closely enough to find that fragment. Purbright sighed softly. In Flaxford, people tended to underestimate the degree to which others paid attention, including their inspector. He turned the letter over. The date, 1994, had begun to feel less like an essential clue and more like a decoy, conveniently distant but not distant enough to be ancient, old enough to evoke forgotten records but recent enough to align with living memories. The wording bothered him more than the date. Meant for someone in your present day. Not for posterity. Not for a future archivist. But for someone alive now. Someone who would read it and understand or remember. A whistleblower, a disgruntled employee, a volunteer discovering irregularities, someone who feared what happened in the cathedral's finances decades ago might one day resurface. He recalled Hawtrey's unease when the restricted box was mentioned. The way he hovered behind him as though afraid Purbright might open it and unleash some sleeping accusation. His insistence that the irregularities were trivial. His sudden need to check the vestry first thing in the morning. And the smudge on the corner of the box. Purbright's pencil tapped the desk softly. Hawtrey may not have been the culprit, but he was certainly entangled. Nervous men tended to insert themselves into matters that threatened their sense of order. He might be hiding someone else's wrongdoing, or merely the embarrassment of poor oversight. Yet the midnight intruder's behaviour did not match Hawtrey's temperament. The canon was many things, anxious, meticulous, worn by duty, but stealthy was not one of them. He lacked the discretion required to slip through the cathedral by night without leaving a catastrophically noisy trail. Purbright reflected next on Rixby, a former treasurer with lingering unease about old accounts. Seen recently in the vestry, known to revisit matters that should have been settled. And yet Rixby possessed a kind of restless guilt that tended to express itself outwardly, not through covert midnight wanderings. If he had tampered with the records, he would have over-explained his innocence long before anyone suspected him. His thoughts drifted to Mrs. Groves, enthusiastic, curious, persuasive. She thrived on proximity to hidden things, but she also thrived on being seen. Her interest in secrets was performative. She enjoyed being the bearer of half-truths. She would never have risked entering the cathedral unseen. There would have been an audience, or at least an alibi ready for embellishment. Purbright exhaled. The intruder was someone less visible. Someone used to moving quietly, who understood the building's rhythms. His mind returned to Tressel's remark. Someone trying not to be noticed, wearing a coat too fine for rummaging. A new member of the Friends of Saint-Olave Society. A man carrying a folder, slipping through the vestry door last week. He had no name. Just a silhouette shaped by habit and wariness. Purbright looked down at the letter one final time. Its warning, its vagueness, its understated urgency. It had been tucked with just enough care to appear accidental, yet hidden well enough to delay discovery. Whoever wrote it had feared that something buried in the Cathedral's records, perhaps in that very restricted box, would eventually surface. And the person who wrote it had trusted neither the church nor the town to handle it honestly. He folded the letter again, more gently than before. Then he rose, reached for his coat, and headed toward the cathedral precinct with slow, deliberate steps. He was not going to question anyone yet. He was simply going to watch. Observation, he had long ago learned, often solved the part of the case that interrogation never could. Inspector Purbright walked slowly along the precinct path, letting the late afternoon light slide across the stone and settle into its familiar golden quiet. He had no intention of questioning anyone further that day. Questions tended to push people into postures, defensive, self-righteous, evasive. Observation, on the other hand, required nothing of them and often revealed everything. He positioned himself on a bench near the cloister arch, a place where the comings and goings of cathedral staff passed naturally within view. He sat with a newspaper folded across his lap, unread, his posture that of a man practicing idleness with seasoned skill. The events of the past 2 days arranged themselves in his mind with the slow, deliberate cadence of a puzzle solving itself. The midnight disturbance, the displaced box, the glossy magazine scrap, the whispers about old accounts, all of it circled around a single, persistent truth. Someone feared that the past was no longer safely hidden. He drew the letter from his coat pocket, unfolded it once more, and reread the same carefully typed words he had studied a dozen times. It struck him again that the writing lacked personality. Not anonymity, but an effort to strip away anything that might betray the writer's hand. This was not how people wrote when they wished to frighten. It was how they wrote when they wished to inform without being recognized. He refolded it, his glance drifting to the cathedral's great west door, just as Mrs. Groves emerged, bustling with self-appointed purpose. She clutched her tote bag in the manner of someone guarding state secrets. As she crossed the courtyard, she paused to fuss with a notice board, repositioning a leaflet with more force than necessary. Purbright noted the tension in her movements. Enthusiasm could disguise many things, but it seldom disguised fear, and Mrs. Groves did not strike him as fearful. Expectant, perhaps, but not unsettled. A moment later, Mr. Rixby appeared from the side entrance, walking with the air of a man fleeing only the memory of his conscience. He carried nothing, but his eyes darted lightly toward the vestry door before he hurried across the square. Not guilty, Purbright thought, but troubled. Rixby had the look of someone revisiting old mathematics and discovering the sums no longer comforted him. Purbright let his attention drift to the opposite end of the cloister, where Canon Hawtrey emerged next. The canon looked worn, more so than his usual state of perpetual agitation. His steps were measured, careful, as though his body feared some unseen misstep might reveal him. He carried a small booklet under his arm, something thin enough not to be a record, yet important enough to grip tightly. Purbright watched how Hawtrey's eyes flickered automatically toward the vestry door, not long enough to draw suspicion from anyone else, but long enough to betray its significance. Guilt? Possibly, but just as possibly a man terrified of being blamed for something he hadn't done. Anxiety often made poor disguise. Tressel, the organ technician, followed not long after. He emerged from the north transept with an expression of sour concentration, wiping dust from his hands onto his trousers. He spotted Purbright and nodded with brief civility before departing. His movements were smooth, economical, unbothered. Tressel had a blunt honesty that was difficult to reconcile with midnight intrusions. Purbright waited. Nothing happened. The courtyard resumed its quiet rhythms. Footsteps, murmured greetings, the faint drift of pigeons cooing from the roofline. And beneath it, the steady hum of unseen tension. It was not loud, but pervasive, like a rope pulled tight between several unseen hands. He leaned back, letting the stillness speak. People behaved honestly in silence. They walked with their true burdens then. He considered the letter again. A warning about omission, not action. The word gnawed at him. Omission could refer to missing records, unreported discrepancies, or something deliberately not accounted for. It could refer to a lie concealed by absence, or a truth quietly pruned from an archive. Or it could refer to someone omitted from a record, someone whose role had been purposely diminished or erased. He thought again of the man described by Tressel. Middle-aged, well-dressed, carrying a folder, moving with caution, slipping out a side door. A person who navigated the cathedral with the body language of someone who expected not to be recognized or not to be remembered. A man Craik had seen with Mrs. Groves receiving documents from her tote bag, a man who hadn't appeared since. Purbright drew in a slow breath. There was always someone in a story like this. Someone not loudly involved, not part of the usual gossip circuit, a person too sensible to be suspected and too distant to be remembered, a visitor who needed something from the past, or who feared what the past contained. The evening bells began to ring. Parishioners drifted in for evensong, their footsteps soft across the cloister stones. Purbright rose, folding the newspaper under his arm. One detail lingered in his mind, small and persistent: the magazine scrap. A piece of modern print lodged in a hymnal that no modern visitor would have reason to open. A mistake by someone not accustomed to the rhythm of the cathedral, someone hurried, someone handling books unfamiliar to them. Not a clergyman, not a volunteer, not Rixby, not Tressel, not the choir boys. Someone new, someone who did not know where old things belonged. Purbright stepped into the cool shadow of the nave, the letter once again tucked safely away. He knew now that the next move would not come from him. The next reveal would come from whoever feared the past most. And fear, he reflected, rarely stayed hidden for long. Inspector Purbright had always believed that truth possessed a certain fragility. Press too hard, and it splintered. Approach too softly, and it retreated into corners. The trick was to coax it into daylight with just enough pressure to make someone uncomfortable, but not enough to make them defensive. That evening, under the mellow hush following evensong, he found the moment he had been waiting for. The congregation drifted out in polite murmurs, their footsteps a soft procession across the flagstones. A few lingered for conversation. Canon Hawtrey fussed over hymn sheets. Mrs. Groves organized leaflets no one wanted. Mr. Rixby hovered near the side chapel as though torn between leaving and confessing something entirely unrelated. Then came the man Purbright had been expecting. not by knowledge of his face, but by the unmistakable air of someone hoping to pass unnoticed. He stepped away from the far pews with careful, almost practiced subtlety. Middle height, neat coat, polished shoes, the look of a civil servant who hoped his clothing would explain him before he needed to speak. He had the same vague bearing described by Tressel and Craik, a visitor who did not behave like a visitor. Purbright let a few seconds pass, observing the man's direction. He moved toward the cloister door, not quickly, but with the controlled pace of someone avoiding attention. The inspector began walking too, not intercepting, merely drifting in the same direction until their paths crossed naturally at the archway. "Good evening," Purbright said pleasantly. The man startled with professional restraint. "Oh, good evening." "Lovely service," Purbright continued, as though commenting on the weather. "This hour always seems to bring out the cathedral's best qualities." "Yes," the man said quickly. "Very atmospheric." "A first visit?" Purbright asked. "No," the man replied, then immediately corrected himself. "I mean, yes, first this week." Purbright smiled politely. One loses track of time easily in places like this. There was a flicker, a tightening of the jaw, a momentary calculation. Purbright recognized it. Not the calculation of guilt, but of someone wondering how much they had already revealed. "I must be going," the man said, stepping past. Purbright nodded. "Of course. Though if you have a moment, I've been trying to make sense of something, and perhaps you can help. Purely a matter of curiosity." The man hesitated. Exactly the hesitation Purbright had expected. "In the choir stalls earlier this week," Purbright said conversationally, "a fragment of modern magazine was found tucked inside a hymnal. A strange thing. We don't see much glossy paper left in those volumes." The man froze almost imperceptibly. It was only a pause, the space of half a breath, but every instinct in Purbright sharpened. It was the reaction of someone whose mind abruptly leapt to a place they hoped it would not. "A magazine?" the man repeated, trying for lightness. "People leave all sorts of things in churches." "Indeed," Purbright agreed. "Bookmark, service sheets, shopping lists. But this one was rather unusual. Late-century technology advert, not something typically found in a hymnal printed in 1882. "I wouldn't know," the man said quietly. Purbright gave a small, amiable nod. "Most people wouldn't." The man shifted, as though deciding whether to walk away or remain polite. Purbright saved him the effort. "You see," he added gently, "what troubled me was its placement. Not loose, but wedged carefully, almost deliberately, and quite recently, judging by its condition." A second hesitation, longer this time, and accompanied by a faint tightening of the shoulders. The inspector continued softly. "The cathedral has many old documents, some recently moved, some recently touched. People worry about such things. We want records, accounts, sealed boxes. Worry makes them handle things they ought to leave alone." The man's eyes fixed on Purbright. He did not blink. "So I find myself wondering," Purbright said with quiet civility, "whether the person who placed that magazine scrap did so by accident, perhaps while retrieving something else." "I've no idea what you're talking about," the man said, but the tone was no longer even. His voice had thinned slightly, stretched by wariness. Purbright did not press. Instead, he stepped back with an apologetic gesture. "Forgive me, I do rattle on. Occupational habit. Unlikely details tend to interest me far more than they should." The man nodded stiffly and moved toward the exit. Purbright followed only with his eyes. He watched as the man passed Mrs. Groves, who greeted him with a startle of recognition, quickly suppressed. Her hand tightened around her tote bag. She did not approach him, nor he her, but there was something in the avoidance, something mutual, and carefully measured. Purbright's attention then shifted to Canon Hawtrey, who looked at the man with a brief expression of surprise, bordering on dread, before immediately pretending not to notice him. Hawtrey's fingers tugged anxiously at his sleeve again, brushing away invisible chalk. And finally, Trestle. From the far transept he watched silently, arms folded, gaze sharp and unbending, not suspicious of the man's actions, suspicious of the man himself. The visitor hurried down the cloister, the echo of his footsteps betraying more haste than dignity. Purbright remained still. His test had worked. One casual remark about the magazine scrap, nothing more, had told him what days of questioning had failed to. The man's reaction, the flinch, the tightening, the instinctive denial too quick for composure, it all revealed something deeply relevant. He knew precisely what had been found in the hymnal, and he was terrified someone else would connect it to him. As the cloister door closed with a soft click, Purbright felt the shape of the investigation shift. Threads that had previously run parallel now converged. The letter, the records, the midnight disturbance, they no longer pointed to a general unease. They pointed to a specific individual, someone who had handled the cathedral's past with unsuitable confidence, someone who met with Mrs. Groves, someone who moved through the building with caution rather than familiarity, someone who suspected the consequences of what lay in the restricted box. Purbright walked slowly toward the nave, every step deliberate. He did not yet know the man's name, but he had found the one person in Flaxford who wanted the truth buried deeply enough to dig for it in the dead of night. And now, after one small question, the man knew Purbright had begun digging too. The chapter house at St. Olave's was an unusually calm room for revelations. Its high, vaulted ceiling softened even the most uncomfortable truths, and its polished floor seemed to steady the footsteps of anyone obliged to cross it. Inspector Purbright had chosen it deliberately. Confessions behaved better in rooms that discouraged raised voices. He arrived early, allowing the morning light to stretch quietly across the long oak table. The man from the cloister, the one whose face still lacked a name, had been invited by a polite note left for him at the cathedral welcome desk. It was not an official summons. Purbright knew better than to frighten prey already inclined to bolt. One by one the others drifted in, Canon Hawtrey wringing his hands, Mrs. Groves bright with self-importance, Mr. Rixby attempting dignity and failing, and finally Mr. Trestle, whose presence Purbright had insisted upon with the firmness of someone who trusted blunt honesty above social grace. The unnamed man entered last. Today he no longer attempted inconspicuousness. His shoulders were squared, though too rigidly to appear confident. The mild circles beneath his eyes hinted at a night spent considering the worst possible outcomes. Purbright stood. "Thank you all for coming. I realize the hour is early, but matters touching the cathedral's records are best settled before rumour becomes scripture." Canon Hawtrey made a strangled noise of agreement. Purbright gestured to the chairs. "Please." They settled, some stiffly, others sinking with weary resignation. The anonymous visitor remained standing until Purbright indicated the empty seat to his right. "I thought," Purbright began softly, "it might be helpful to clarify the concerns raised by recent events, a letter found in the choir stall, a disturbance in the vestry, and certain documents from the West Window accounts. Documents that someone has taken a keen interest in." No one spoke. Purbright continued. "2 days ago I examined the restricted box in the safe. It had been moved recently, not opened, but checked, quietly, and in haste." Rixby inhaled sharply. Hawtrey stared at the table. Then, Purbright went on, a fragment of modern magazine paper was found inside a hymnal, glossy, uncreased, recently placed. Not something a parishioner would bring, but something someone unfamiliar with cathedral books might accidentally leave behind. His gaze slid toward the unnamed man, who stiffened but said nothing. Finally, Purbright said, a letter dated 1994 was placed behind the choir stall, not forgotten, not mislaid, planted, recently, by someone who wished it to be found in the present. Mrs. Groves looked offended, as though deception of this kind diminished the romance of the mystery. Purbright folded his hands neatly. The warning in the letter speaks of omission, not theft, not fraud, omission, something left out, or someone left out. He turned to the unnamed man. Sir, perhaps we should begin by asking your name. The man hesitated, then exhaled. My name is Malcolm Dane. Canon Hawtrey blinked. Rixby's forehead furrowed. Tressel merely grunted. Purbright nodded. Mr. Dane is a civil accountant with the Diocesan Archive Office. His presence here this week was not recreational. Dane's shoulders sank. I didn't mean to cause trouble. No, Purbright said calmly. You meant to verify something. He moved toward the center of the room, hands loosely clasped. Mr. Dane has been reviewing historic irregularities across diocesan properties. A quiet initiative, I believe. Dane nodded reluctantly. And when he compared the West Window accounts held at the Cathedral with the master copies kept centrally, he found missing invoices, a discrepancy, not large, but deliberate, something trimmed, adjusted, omitted. Purbright let the word land gently. Mrs. Groves clutched her tote bag in triumph. Hawtrey wilted. Rixby appeared mortified for reasons yet unclear. Purbright continued, the original documents from the 1990s, the ones that should have explained these omissions, were sealed by the Dean at the time. When Mr. Dane tried to locate them, he discovered the Cathedral version incomplete. Someone had removed or replaced pages before the box was sealed, Hawtrey whispered. Good heavens! Purbright returned to his chair. Mr. Dane, you were correct to investigate. What you did not anticipate was how protective people become when old mistakes risk being exposed to new scrutiny. Dane rubbed his temples. I wasn't trying to accuse anyone, I just needed to know whether the missing pages had been lost or intentionally removed. Purbright nodded. Which brings us to the letter. He addressed the group. The letter was written 30 years ago by the Cathedral's assistant bursar, a man named Geoffrey Loon. He discovered that certain financial entries relating to the West Window repairs had been altered, not to enrich anyone, nothing so dramatic, but to hide a shortfall caused by administrative overreach. Rixby flinched, confirming Purbright's suspicion. The bursar wrote the letter as a contingency, Purbright said. A quiet record of what really happened in case the truth was ever needed, but he never dared confront the Dean who sealed the box, and before he could do more, the bursar moved away. Mrs. Groves whispered, "Oh my!" Purbright's voice softened. Mr. Dane suspected the missing invoices were connected to that period, and he searched for any surviving trace. That is why he entered the cathedral after hours. Not to take anything, only to confirm whether the sealed box matched the diocesan log. Hawtrey's face tightened with guilt. I thought someone meant to damage the records. I never imagined. Purbright raised a calming hand. No one here intended harm, but someone did omit documents long ago, and someone else recently feared that omission would come to light. All eyes turned to Rixby, who looked suddenly much older. He swallowed. It was a mistake, he said softly. I wasn't treasurer then, just an assistant. The Dean insisted certain adjustments were necessary. I didn't remove the invoices, but I knew they were missing. I kept quiet. I thought correcting the shortfall quietly was better than letting the council see. Purbright nodded gently. A small omission, but a dangerous one. He looked around the table. Mr. Dane's arrival, Mrs. Groves's enthusiasm, Canon Hawtrey's anxiety, all pushed the old secret toward the surface. The letter in the choir stall was Loon's attempt to preserve the truth for the future. Dane's midnight visit was a search for accuracy. And the displaced box, well, that was fear. Silence settled. Not tense, simply honest. Purbright concluded there was no crime in the end, just the long shadow of a muddled decision made 30 years ago. But shadows, when left unattended, tend to grow. No one contradicted him. The chapter house breathed again, its solemn calm restored. Purbright closed his notebook. I believe we understand the matter now. And for the first time that week, every person present seemed relieved not to know more than they should. In the days following the chapter house meeting, the cathedral gradually settled back into its habitual rhythm, though something subtle in the air seemed lighter, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. The bells still rang with their usual dignified punctuality, the vergers still polished brass with almost religious dedication, and the choir boys still managed to look both angelic and entirely capable of mischief. Yet those who had sat around the oak table with Inspector Purbright carried themselves with a faint but unmistakable shift in manner, less taut, less furtive, as though they had stepped out from behind a shadow. Canon Hawtrey, for one, moved through the nave with a humility that was almost graceful. The stiffness that once clung to his posture had softened, replaced by a kind of cautious relief. He had not been guilty of anything beyond anxiety, yet even that had weighed heavily. Now he walked with the look of a man whose conscience had been gently untangled. Mrs. Groves, meanwhile, discovered renewed purpose. Liberated from the burden of half-suspected conspiracies, she redirected her enthusiasm toward the cathedral's newsletter, where she produced an article titled A Brief Reflection on Historical Integrity. She had shown Purbright a draft which contained several dramatic flourishes and at least one reference to mysterious nocturnal rustlings. He politely suggested moderation. She ignored him, of course, but he appreciated being consulted. Mr. Tressel, the organ technician, became uncharacteristically sociable, by his standards, which meant he nodded at people twice instead of once. Purbright suspected that seeing truth emerge through calm explanation had secretly pleased him. Tressel liked things properly tuned, whether pipes or people. As for Mr. Rixby, he returned only once to the cathedral after the revelation, lingering near the vestry in a way that suggested farewell more than obligation. Purbright watched him from a distance. The man did not seem ashamed so much as released. The long shadow he had carried for years finally accounted for. When he eventually walked away, it was with the slow, reflective pace of someone who had finally balanced a forgotten ledger. And Malcolm Dane, the quiet accountant whose nervousness had nearly knotted itself into trouble, sent Purbright a courteous letter expressing gratitude for his discretion and insight. The letter was neatly typed, without any attempt at anonymity. Purbright found this pleasing. Yet even with the matter resolved, the cathedral still held the echo of the incident. Gossip, being an industrious creature, continued to flutter through the cloister tea-room, reinventing details at every turn. One version insisted the dean of the 1990s had embezzled thousands. Another declared the whole saga the fault of a ghost. A third, circulated confidently by Mrs. Winkfield, placed Purbright at the centre of a daring midnight pursuit through the cloisters. Purbright neither confirmed nor denied this, preferring the tranquillity that came from letting Flaxford entertain itself. For his part, the inspector returned to his routine with characteristic quietness. His office, dimly lit by an obliging window, felt familiar and honest after the cathedral's layered solemnity. Papers sat neatly in trays, reports waited to be signed, and the small electric kettle in the corner hummed more faithfully than many citizens. He spent a morning completing the final documentation for the case, though case felt too dramatic a word for what had unfolded. There was no criminal charge to pursue, no formal accusation to file. The truth had emerged gently, requiring little more than patience and attentiveness. Still, he made his notes carefully, placing the original 1994 letter in a small folder marked Cat 94 Investigative Reference, Handled. The folder was thin. Purbright found that reassuring. When he stepped out into the station corridor, Constable Burton intercepted him with a sheaf of unrelated paperwork and a hopeful expression. "Anything serious next, sir?" Purbright considered this. "I expect not." Burton looked mildly disappointed, as though hoping for the occasional excitement that livened an otherwise predictable schedule. Purbright offered him a kindly look. "Quiet is underrated, Burton. It tends to keep things from getting out of hand." Burton nodded, unconvinced but obedient. Later that afternoon, Purbright walked once more through the cathedral precinct, partly out of habit and partly because he found satisfaction in observing how order restored itself. The stones still held the memory of recent tension, but it had softened into something gentler, like the fading verse of a hymn. He paused near the choir stalls, letting his hand rest lightly on the old carved wood. The space felt untroubled now. The letter had fulfilled its purpose, not by exposing crime, but by allowing the truth of a long-past omission to surface with dignity rather than scandal. Geoffrey Loon's message, planted so cautiously decades ago, had found its reader at last. Purbright allowed himself a rare moment of quiet reflection. People were complicated, institutions even more so. Secrets rarely behaved like villains in novels. They did not leap out dramatically, but lingered shyly, waiting to be acknowledged. And when they finally were, the world rarely collapsed. It simply breathed easier. He stepped back into the courtyard. Mrs. Malkin greeted him with a brisk nod, arms full of hymnals she intended to reorganize, properly this time. A pair of choir boys ran past at a speed just slow enough to avoid reprimand. A tourist snapped a picture of a gargoyle that had no historical significance whatsoever. Life, Purbright thought, had returned to its usual, endearingly tangled pace. He reached the gate, paused, and glanced back once more at the cathedral's grand west window, gleaming in the late light, entirely unaware of the decades of administrative drama conducted beneath it. Then he turned, straightened his coat, and walked toward the station. Another day, another puzzle concluded. And now, at last, a stretch of quiet paperwork awaited him, precisely the kind he found most comforting.